You are listening to The Magic Hour. Today we're talking about channeling, spirit guides, twin flames, and ascension with my teacher, mystic and channel, Sal Rachele. His 7 books on esoteric studies, the history of the universe, and the development of the soul have inspired and intrigued the masses. Sal will be sharing his tips, tricks for how we can prepare for this very special time in human evolution. Are you ready to make some magic? Hey everybody, Shereen here. Welcome to The Magic Hour. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for coming. The Magic Hour drops every Sunday for your enjoyment, and show notes are all found over at mylittlemagicshop.com, our official sponsor. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed, Spotify, or iTunes. You can also follow me on Instagram at mylittlemagicshop and Facebook. All links are in the show notes. Our guest today is mystic channel, healer, teacher, and author, Sal. Welcome, Sal. I'm incredibly excited to have you here today.
Well, it's wonderful to be here.
So as much as I want to just dive in and ask you 75 million questions, here on The Magic Hour, I'm committed to learning from healers about their individual transition to healing first. So can you tell me a little bit about your upbringing? Like, where did you grow up?
Well, I was raised in a somewhat atheist household, and we did belong to the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is a non-denominational church. There's people there who are atheists, who don't believe in God. I was brought up in a scientific environment. My dad was a math and physics teacher at the university, and I came into this from an I don't know, I want to find out kind of true scientific approach. And to really honestly answer the question how I got involved in a healing path, I'd have to look at past lives, that this was all preordained that I would be doing healing path in this lifetime. But in the 1970s, I had several powerful awakening experiences. Was always interested in parapsychology, psychic phenomena, things like that. And I ended up going to a Silva method presentation where the Silva graduates told me all about people in my life that they couldn't possibly have known anything about unless they were functioning psychically. So that was one of my, you could say, catalysts to get myself going. So I did extensive work with the Silva method and other meditation techniques and things of that sort. And then I had some more powerful experiences where I became aware that there were beings from other star systems and other dimensions interacting with the Earth, and I started communicating with them directly. And one thing just kind of led to another. I started doing healing work, I guess, back in the 1980s, and then I started channeling spirit guides in the 1990s, but not publicly until the 2000s because I was a little bit down on channeling. It seems like there's a lot of inaccurate channels out there, and I didn't want to be caught in ego or giving out false information. So I waited many, many years after I started communicating with my spirit guides before I started putting the material out publicly. So that's kind of the really ultra short version of how I got started.
I love that. I mean, it's so interesting because you came from such like a scientific background, and then you kind of slowly made your way into all of this metaphysical and definitely, not yet proven by science type of.
Well, I had an experience where the angels took me up into the celestial realms. This was again back in the 70s, when I was having an IT career in Silicon Valley at the time. And so here's this right brain side of me to kind of counteract this left brain technical side.
Because I feel like I'm kind of built that way too. And then I just kept coming, started with the science. And then I was just like, wait a second. But I find that like some of the best and greatest scientists were also mystics. That's like one thing people don't talk about a lot. So it makes perfect sense.
Both Einstein and Tesla, said that they got messages from God.
Yeah. And then and Galileo was an astrologer. Like there's so many out there where they studied, all these esoteric topics, and lots of things happen. But okay, so my next question is with channeling. I wanted to understand a little bit more about, especially for those who have never spoken with the channel or communicated with the channel or had a reading with someone who channels. What does it feel like for you?
Well, it's It's not that dramatic because I use a technique called telepathic transmission. And that's where it's basically I'm just receiving telepathic messages from spirit guides. And then my personal spirit guide, Leah, is more like what we would call conscious channeling because I do bring her energy through my body. Whereas my other spirit guides I work with, I don't really bring very much of their energy in because they're at a very high vibration and my body is not conditioned to be able to handle prolonged periods of high vibration. So it's more like I'm simply sitting down with a bunch of friends around the dinner table or something, and except that they're not in physical bodies, or they are in bodies, but they're in higher dimensions, in a phase shifted out of this dimension. There's different types of spirit guides. There's discarnate entities, there's actual spirit guides from the spirit realms, then there's extraterrestrials who have actual bodies in another dimension. So there's different types of spirit guides. I work a little bit with all three of those types, but primarily extraterrestrials in higher dimensions. That's kind of the dominant group that I work with.
Interesting. And so tell me a little bit about like one of the first times that, like one of these beings came to you. Were you like kind of like freaked out? Were you like excited? Like how did it feel for you?
It actually felt very calm and peaceful. I was hiking up on Bell Rock in Sedona. This was in the late 1980s. And it was right after a little afternoon thunderstorm, which they sometimes have in the summertime. And so the air was all sparkling clean from a 10-minute downpour of rain. And I'm walking along the rocks, looking at the little rivulets of water because every time it rains on Bell Rock, there's little waterfalls that kind of cascade down off the rocks. And it was very peaceful. And all of a sudden I heard, "Hello, dear one," in my inner ear. It was Leah, my personal spirit guide, reminding me of who she was. And she told me when we were last together in the same dimension and that she was going to work with me in this lifetime. And it was all very matter of fact, no big deal, but it felt deeply calming and peaceful.
Mhm.
And that was kind of the beginning with Leah. And then the Arcturians came to me a long time after that, and the founders came to me many, many years after. And Lord Sananda, the Oversoul of Jesus, was one of the latest ones that came to me. By 2005, I pretty much had my group of beings that I work with. There's just been a few that I've connected with momentarily and maybe did an unusual channeling experience, let's say, with Archangel Michael, which I normally don't channel. But I also work with Thoth and Isis occasionally. But most of the time, it's Lord Sananda, Leah, the Arcturians, and the founders. Those are my set of guides.
Got it. Oh, you got fancy guides. I love it. Okay, so how do you strengthen your channeling ability? So, like, like you're sitting, in this wonderful, peaceful experience. Leah's talking to you, and so from there, like, like you got up, and then you, of course, like continued on with life. So you're like, okay, I want more of this. Like, how are you able to kind of build on your ability to ensure that you're channeling the information and it's also like not getting tied up with ego and that it's, coming through really purely and cleanly?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And this, again, is the reason why I didn't start putting channeled messages out when I first started connecting with my guides, for that very reason. I didn't want to be corrupting the messages with my ego. And so having a strong connection with my own higher self really came first. And I think that is a prerequisite for being a good channel, is that you have to have a good relationship with your higher self. Because if I lose the connection momentarily, and it can happen, I could be in a channeling session and somebody could crash a dish on the floor in the next room or something, and it kind of jars me out of the session a little bit. My higher self has to kind of take over until I reestablish the connection.
Yeah.
And that's happened numerous times where I've gone in and out of my higher self. So basically what I do is I go to my higher self, and then here's the entity. And so it's like higher self, entity, higher self, entity. Human self is down here doing
Mhm.
whatever it's doing. So when I lose the connection to the entity, I fall back into the higher self. So now higher self is speaking. And then the entity comes back in, then it's higher self. So it's a blend of higher self and entity, basically.
For those listeners that are just, starting to understand what this higher self term means, can you tell them a little bit about like your experience with your higher self and like just maybe even a definition of a higher self?
Yes, and I actually have a rather complicated definition of higher self because I have one of my books is called Soul Integration, and in that book, you probably have a copy there, huh? So in that book, I have a 12-dimensional model system for the universe, and each of us is a 12-dimensional being. Now, we've only activated maybe 4 of our dimensions: the physical, emotional, mental, and astral. And we're working on the etheric, which is our 5th level of ourselves. But then we have a causal body, which is level 6, and then we have 6 higher levels, 7 through 12. And the catch-all phrase for the 6 higher levels is higher self. So the higher self, these are fancy names. The names are not that important, especially when you're going above level 7, because the names are just pointers towards things that are beyond words. So it's soul. Level 7 is the soul. Level 8 is the oversoul. Level 9 is the monad. And then we have levels 10, 11, and 12, which we call the God levels. So we have like a Christic Buddhic self, individual God self, and universal God self. So if you put all of that together, you have what's called the higher self. And it goes by various names: I am presence, infinite I am, just different, the God self. There's different names for those levels. Different aspects of the higher self may come in at different times depending on what the soul needs to learn.
Yeah, I love that. So you guys have to definitely get, Saul's book. Well, he has many books. I have them all, but this one in particular, I think is really great because it breaks it down. And I know that for me, like I had to read it over and over and over again to kind of get a pretty decent grasp. I do think that like developing that connection with your higher self, or like, and anybody can do it and everybody should do it, developing that connection with your higher self is extremely, extremely important. Going back to, this journey of life for you, Saul, at what moment did you know that you had to move towards sharing your gifts with others? So I know you had mentioned it was, in the early 2000s, you felt confident and, like you felt like it was time, but was there like a moment where you're like, okay, I'm ready?
Yeah, this was actually much, much earlier. It was during my Silicon Valley days. I was sitting out on my balcony overlooking the San Jose or whatever, wherever I was. It was, I think, 1976. And it was as though somebody had just taken the lid off my head and poured all this knowledge into my head. It was like a major download. We didn't even call them downloads back then. I worked on the early personal computers like Commodore, and so it was like we had maybe energy transmission. Maybe we could have called it that back then. But anyway, there was all this clarity and wisdom in that download that came in, and there was this kind of like revealing of the future, prophecy kind of thing, and it showed that I knew that I was going to be doing the kind of things that I'm doing now. I saw images of myself, teaching and healing, and I knew that I would eventually leave the IT world and be more into healing and spirituality. And it was only a couple of years later that I joined a holistic healing community in Santa Cruz, and that was kind of my intro to really living a spiritual life. But I knew that I'd be doing this kind of work. It's shown to me, basically.
I really love that you share this part because I think that especially now, especially this year, there's so many people that are kind of, feeling dissatisfied with the way that their life is and like kind of living in this very traditional experience that we're told is what's going to bring us happiness, and they're starting to really question and trying to figure out, like what their next step is. So I think it's always important to kind of hear more stories of that so people don't feel like they're so, alone in that desire. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, and I would have to say to people that it's not an easy journey. I kind of feel like my journey's been easier than most. That's just my kind of personal feeling because, I've worked with thousands of people, and I'd say the average person probably has a much harder time of it than I've had. Nevertheless, it takes a lot of commitment to not get sucked into what today is popularly called the matrix, which is the beliefs of society, basically, is the short definition. And because we're not taught that we're powerful, creative, spiritual beings, we're taught that we're little helpless human beings, helpless and dependent on big daddy or mommy government to save us, or big corporation to save us, or somebody to save us, right? An old fashioned image of Jesus coming to save us. And we're not taught to go within. Even though it says in the Bible, the kingdom of God is within, people are still looking up on the cross for Jesus.
So true. So, like, speaking of difficulties within that journey, I wanted to know if you would share a little bit about if there ever any moments where you kind of had doubt, doubts about your spiritual path, doubts about your gifts, doubts about your ability to, manifest the things that you visualized and saw for yourself. And how did you manage those?
Well, surprisingly, maybe I've had very few doubts regarding my abilities and regarding the presence of God. I think probably at the purely physical level, there's been some doubts. For example, if the physical body is out of balance, do I have what it takes within me to restore my own body to balance quickly? So there's definitely been some doubts, I'd say, on the physical level, just as there would be doubts on the physical level when it comes to, if you live under an oppressive government and they can physically force you to do certain things. But on the mental and emotional levels, I feel like I've been fairly clear and clean when it comes to these things. It's like nobody's going to get me to believe in something that's not for my highest good, really, at this point in my life, anyway. But I feel like that's been that way for a long time. I feel like I'm on a path that's being orchestrated by my higher self. It's like I couldn't stray off the path even if I wanted to. It was kind of the feeling, because something would always bring me back, even if it's I decided to go off on a drinking binge or something, and then my body would start rebelling after the third or fourth drink and say, "No, you don't want to do this." That I'm using a down to earth example that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think that's a good example. And it sounds like you have a whole lot of trust in the process, which I can tell you that's not easy for everybody.
Yeah, again, I have a trust on many of the inner levels, and again, it's more challenging on the physical level because our physical body is subject to all these environmental stimulus and
Yeah.
everything that's going on around us, and so it tends to attempt to distract us from our inner truth.
That completely makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. So, I've read most of your books and have gifted quite a few copies to friends. And I would say that Life on the Cutting Edge really blew me away. And my favorite part about your writing is that it doesn't feel fear based. Like, even no matter what, like you're talking about, no matter what you're sharing, like it feels very like non-judgmental and loving. So I wanted to also always say, I wanted to reiterate that all your books really feel heavy but in a loving and playful way. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your books and maybe which one was your favorite one to write so far?
Well, Life on the Cutting Edge was the very first book, and I do have a second edition now because I went back and there's the original. You've got the original. So, it became outdated because these were books have a lot of prophecy in them. A lot of the prophecy came true as predicted, but there was some of the timetables were off a little bit. Some of the details were off a little bit, which is inevitable in any prophecy. In fact, if you talk to a prophet or a psychic who claims to be 100% accurate, I tell people run in the opposite direction. Yeah. Because no good psychic or intuitive person is going to ever claim 100% accuracy. It's not possible to be 100% accurate because of free will. People can change their minds about things. So basically, these books are reading the consciousness of humanity and then extrapolating out from that the most likely scenarios. The books are a collaboration between me and my spirit guides, the founders, which are creator gods from the 12th level, the very highest beings that I work with. So the Life on the Cutting Edge was my first book. There was a lot about my journey and through the 70s, 80s, and 90s in there. The book came out in the 90s. Then we had Earth Changes in 2012, which is now called Earth Changes and Beyond, which is a lot about prophecy, and also it was the first look at the history of the Earth. The history of there's the Earth Changes original edition. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Earth Awakens is the one with the Andromeda Galaxy on the front. So Earth Changes and Earth Awakens were really about, why did humanity get to be the way that it is today? What were the steps or the stories that led to the world as it is today? Earth Changes and Earth Awakens books are a bit prophetic. They're talk about what's happened and where we've been and where we're going as humanity. And there's some pretty radical ideas in there, some of which are still kind of radical. One of the more radical ideas that the founders brought forth was the idea that there could be massive immune system failure in humanity, and it could end up, wiping out maybe half of the population at some point. And then this last year, we end up with some exotic viruses showing up and things like that. This is maybe not related directly to your question, but, this last year has given me a chance to really understand more deeply how things like viruses work. And, the founders always said that the problem was immune system failure. The problem is not the viruses, because we have like 150 viruses in our bodies at any given time, but they don't make us sick unless we have a problem with our immune system. So what causes problems with the immune system? It can be emotional upset. It can be bad diet, bad lifestyle, unresolved issues with family and friends. There's a lot of things that can trigger immune system imbalances. But that's one of the prophecies in there that's a bit uncomfortable for people to look at today. And then the vaccines are not going to solve the problem. Sorry to say. So that's one aspect. And then after the Earth Changes and Earth Awakens comes Soul Integration, the book that we looked at first. And again, this really goes into the heart of the matter, which is if you don't integrate the pieces of yourself so that you are working together, everything within you is working together for your highest good, then you tend to experience, again, what we call soul fragmentation, which is where you are fragmented. You're not working together. Your pieces are going every which way. And you say, well, how come I can't manifest anything in my life? Well, because you're not unified, you're not aligned. And so that's kind of the essence of soul integration. And then I have another book on the real history of the Earth, where I go into more depth on extraterrestrial influences that have guided humanity. And I even say in there, yes, it seems like we're laboratory rats, that we've been experimented on by various extraterrestrial groups throughout history. And on one level, that's true, but we are spiritual beings also. So we had to, on some level, give our permission in order to become lab rats. So it's kind of complicated because we're dealing with multiple levels of reality. There's a level where we have been victims. There's a level where we are beyond being victims. There's a level where everything that's ever happened is perfect. All of these levels are valid on the level that they occur on. When people say everything's in perfect divine order and there's a war going on, well, okay, on one level, it's a tragedy. And on another level, it's part of the perfect unfolding of divine creation. And it's really hard to see that it's perfect when your child is getting his leg blown off by a bomb or something, The whole idea of the soul integration is that there's things happening on multiple levels. And then we have the real history of, then we have the mystery of time, which is the next to the last book. And this one is about the fact that we live in multiple timelines, and we can jump from one timeline to another. We can go back into the past and change our past, as long as it doesn't violate the free will of other souls or create time paradoxes, which is a interesting term from physics based on the example that they use called the grandfather paradox, where what would happen if you could travel back in time and you accidentally kill your grandfather. That would mean you were never born.
Yeah.
But if you were never born, you couldn't have gone back and killed him in the first place. So we talk about how to get around the paradox, what's allowed and what's not allowed in time travel and things like that.
Yeah.
And the last book is The Secrets of Unlimited Energy, which is not available in paperback yet. This book basically explores the fact that we live in a sea of almost unlimited energy. And this has been proven scientifically. There's even a few equations in the book, just a few. And it's based, and so you're thinking, well, if we live in this sea of almost unlimited energy, then how come there seems to be energy shortages or scarcities in this world? And it's because of our beliefs. If we believe in lack and scarcity, that's what we're going to experience.
Yeah.
And if 90% of humanity believes in that, then that's what 90% of humanity is going to experience. It's pretty straightforward. We have to raise the frequency of humanity, raise the consciousness of humanity before these new energy technologies can spread out across the earth. Yeah. Otherwise, just a few believers are going to be able to make these devices work.
It's so interesting. How do you feel like, especially given this year, how do you feel like we're doing collectively in terms of raising our vibration?
Well, this year has been a little bit of a disappointment. Even though I was told by my guides that 3/4 of humanity were not moving forward, probably wouldn't make it through the earth changes. Nevertheless, it was easy for me to kind of convince myself that things were doing better than they were. But when I see most of the activities, I'd say this year has been a wake-up call for humanity. And a lot of people are heeding the call. They are waking up. Maybe they're being kind of like slapped awake.
Yeah.
It's like, well, the way I used to do things isn't working anymore. An example would be, a lot of people would go to the tavern or the pub and have a couple of drinks with their buddies, as a way of kind of unwinding after a busy day. And now things like that are hard to do in most places because of lockdowns and quarantines. And so it's kind of forcing people to deal with themselves, to go within. And unfortunately, some people are just drinking themselves into a stupor in their own homes instead of at the tavern. But a lot of people, this is their wake-up call, saying, "Oh, okay, I don't have all the entertainment I used to have, so maybe I got to look at myself, go within." So that's a positive aspect. But there's, the negative aspects would be it's really brought out the tyrants in government, tyrannical governors and tyrannical politicians in general. It's not a left or right thing. It's a tyranny versus freedom thing, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. It transcends the duality of politics. But yet so many people are caught in that duality. They either hate the president or they love the president and worship him. And it's like, wait a minute, can we step back from this duality and by stepping back from it, we learn to transcend it. We say, okay, wait a minute, there's what's the real issue here? And the real issue is that people are depending on things from outside themselves for their well-being, whether the government's going to keep me safe or vaccine's going to keep me safe or some person's going to keep me safe. Well, wait a minute. The fundamental error is that you're not going within. You're not looking for the kingdom of God within. And as long as people are looking to someone outside of themselves to save them, then we're going to have these problems.
It's definitely very, very true. I completely agree with you. And I do think that there are people that I've been noticing more people trying to take responsibility for that and trying to get a little bit more curious, like I feel like 10 years ago, all these conversations would be people would, no, don't, not a big deal. But now people are starting to at least wonder, like, but tell me more, explain, how could I do that? Which
Right.
I think is kind of beautiful. And I think definitely this year for sure has, people kind of stuck with themselves. So it's definitely been pretty interesting. Okay, so you teach a workshop called Timeline Healing. So I personally took it. I thought it was fantastic, and I think it really, really helped me to, develop my intuition. So for those people out there that don't know anything about timeline healing, or this is their first time hearing even the terminology, can you explain what it is?
I mentioned that we can change our timelines. And so in the timeline healing training, we learn how to do that. It's a powerful therapy where we go back. Now, this is not reframing, which is where you pretend you had a happy childhood and you convince your subconscious mind that you had a happy childhood. That's a psychological technique which has some limited usefulness, even though it's not really healing anything because you're in denial about what happened. Timeline healing does not go into denial about anything. You go back to actual traumas that occurred in your past and you give a healing to the self that you were during that trauma. Basically, you journey back in time and you appear in front of your past life self and you give your past life self a healing. And to the past life self, it would be like an angel visitation or something like that. From that moment forward, your future changes because now you have a different past. And so the old past, you had, let's say, abuse, physical abuse, let's say, and nobody came to your rescue, and you grew up hating your father because he physically abused you, and then maybe you had trouble in your relationships with men as a result. And then you go back and you give a healing to the little child that was beaten by the father. Now, every time you think about your past, you remember the wonderful healing that you got when you were being abused. And it makes it so much easier to forgive your father and to forgive men. And you start having much more happy relationships with men as a result. So it is a form of therapy. And it's a very powerful form of therapy. It's a lot of people have experienced it being way more powerful than psychotherapy. And I've had people who were going to therapy once a week for years. Then they came to timeline healing and they had one session and they accomplished more than those years of psychotherapy. And I'm not saying that happens with everyone, of course, but there's been a lot of people who've had that experience. And I think part of that is that we work on the astral, etheric, and causal levels, as well as the physical, emotional, and mental. So those are the subtle levels 4, 5, and 6. Because we're working on all of these lower levels at once, the healing is a lot more effective.
I recommend, those of you that are really interested in this, take this class. I know that I use this as a part of a lot of my healing sessions that I do with clients and like also during my meditation circles on Friday nights. Like I love it. People love it and they experience it as incredibly healing. So I'm super excited that you shared that. I have narrowed down my 45 million questions to 3 questions because I don't want to take up way too much of your time, even though I'll probably just beg you later to come back another time to answer my other questions. But I've narrowed it down to 3. First one is, how does free will, fate, and destiny work when relaying predictions, in your opinion? I know it's a huge question, but I feel like you would be a good person to, kind of.
We have about 8 hours. Yeah, that's about what it would take, is about 8 hours to adequately answer that. Free will and predestiny, or predeterminism, there's different names for it. What makes it complicated is that there's actually 3 levels of reality simultaneously interacting. And in one of the books, I believe it is Earth Changes, there's a section on the 3 parallel Earths. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to will, there are 3 states, essentially 3 states. One is called imprisoned will. Mm. Then we have free will, and then we have God's will. Mm. So these are the 3 states of consciousness that 99.9% of humanity are engaged in one or more of those 3. Imprisoned will, which corresponds to what I call third density. This is where people are slaves to their belief systems. And their behavior is entirely predictable because they are slaves to their belief systems. For example, are you going to see a fundamentalist Christian attending a Buddhist temple? You're not. You can pretty much predict a fundamentalist Christian living in the Bible Belt is going to go to a fundamentalist church every Sunday, at the same time every Sunday. That's not free will. They are a product of their conditioning. If you suggested, hey, let's go to a Buddhist temple this week, they would look at you like you had 3 eyes or something. So, okay, then there's level 4, which is true free will. This is the level of individuality, of I'm a free thinker, I'm letting go of all my belief systems that other people have taught me, and I'm going to find out the truth for myself, and I'm going to decide which courses I'm going to take and when I'm going to take them. As A Course in Miracles says, free will does not give you the right to establish the curriculum. It only means you can elect what you want to take at any given time. So the universal curriculum is part of God's will. That's the next level. But free will says we can choose what to take and when. We can choose to believe in separation from God, or we can choose to believe we're one with God. That's free will. But God itself is beyond free will. So the individual says, okay, I'm going to make my own choices in life. I'm not going to blindly follow the herd. I'm not going to blindly believe the evening news or whatever. So that's the level of true free will. Then you have God's will, which is level 5, fifth density consciousness. So individuality is fourth density consciousness, and God's will is fifth density consciousness. And this is the level where God expresses through you to the world. And so you become an expression of God. Everyone else is also an expression of God, and there's no separation. There's simply one being expressing through billions of bodies. That's level 5. So at that level, there's not free will because everything is God's will. Oh, God wants me to travel, I'll travel. Or God wants me to be with this person, I'll be with this person. Now, a lot of people think that you're giving up your freedom when you surrender to God's will. No, actually, you have more freedom when you're in level 5. The higher dimensions are more free than the lower dimensions. So even though God's will is taking over you, there's a boundless sense of freedom in level 5. And so it's a misconception. People are confusing conformity and unity. Conformity is level 3, unity is level 5. They're completely different, but people get them confused and they think, oh, I have to give up my freedom if I want to be at level 5. No, you don't.
Is it something like, okay, so I'm going to try to do this really simply, but like, is it something like, all right, so God's will is for you to at 4 o'clock today, you're supposed to like spontaneously or synchronistically meet someone at a park. So he's like, or it's like, go to the park, and then how you get there is the free will, the freedom part to the God's will.
Sort of. This is where it needs about 8 hours. This is just the 8-hour conversation, because the non-dualists would say there is no such thing as free will.
Yeah.
They'd say that every decision you made was preordained, that you were going to make that decision. And that could be true on one level. There could be a level where everything you think is a free will decision was already planned out in advance, but you didn't realize it.
Yeah.
And there's some science to back up that idea. There is actually some science. However, in this world, it doesn't make practical sense to live from that state of consciousness, because on the human plane, it really looks like you can choose to put on a yellow sweater or a red sweater, or you can choose to buy a Honda or a Toyota. At a practical level, yeah, there's choices. And, some of the choices may come from conditioning and programming. Well, my father had a Ford and his father had a Ford, so I'm going to buy a Ford. But generally speaking, at that level, it is free will. But you could argue that, yes, it was preordained that you were going to buy a Ford, even without imprisoned will aspect of it. I use an analogy where you climb a tree in the middle of the forest and you look out over the forest and you look down at the path that you've been traveling. And when you're up at the top of the tree, you can see where you've been and where you're going on the path. You can also see all the other possible paths through the forest from up there. And so that's kind of like the higher dimensional view, where you can see there's souls down there making free will choices, but from your perspective, you can see all the possible choices they can make because you're at a higher space. So in that sense, you could say there's no free will. It's all planned out. It's all within this matrix of forest and trees.
Oh, it's super complex. I feel like that's one that I've been like really pondering on lately. But like you said, it will take a bazillion years to probably still arrive to a little bit less confusion.
I think where most people need to go, and I say literally most people, is they need to get out of imprisoned will.
Yeah.
They need to stop being products of their environment and take charge of their own lives. And that's the step where most people are kind of being forced to look at right now. I mean, a lot of people are absolutely shocked that we have corruption in our government. It's like, really? I thought that was only third world countries that had corruption in their government.
Yeah.
Well, guess what?
Yeah, it's definitely true because I think like even with my own personal journey, like I feel like there are moments where you're just like, okay, like wait a second, why did I make that decision? Why did I choose that? Like why did I go down that path? And I feel like that was probably like the first step because like once you start asking why, then you could be like, wait a second, like did I just do that because I was conditioned to or because, something happened to me or
Yeah,
because
that's the starting point.
yeah, and then from there, you start to kinda, like, observe yourself a little bit more, and then you can kind of, start to break away.
Some people go too far in the opposite direction and they rebel against everything and everyone. Any so-called authority, they just immediately rebel. We saw this a lot with the rioting this summer. It's like many of them just got caught up in the emotion of it and they weren't really thinking through what they were doing or why they were doing it. Not making it right or wrong, but just it's a reacting
Yeah.
rather than responding, basically.
And like also that sense of what you had started talking about before, like that people keep looking outside. So like it's like at once, like we're in this place where like some people are still looking for like the government to fix things or like whoever to fix things. And then some people are really pissed off that the government hasn't fixed things. And like and
Right.
then they want to rebel against that where it's like at the end of the day, like it's up to us as individuals to change our belief systems and to create something different and like take our power back. But it's like the first two examples were either way you're giving away your power, like we're like
Exactly.
rebelling and screaming and being angry at, at those that are in power, still you've given them power. So it's about really tapping into your own sense of inner power. And if you don't like something, then just like working to change it, which I
And,
think
and
is
that also brings up the whole ego thing because people fight with their egos and they want to slay their egos.
yeah,
And when you fight with something, you give it power. You give it more power over you when you're fighting with something.
yeah.
So I tell people, love your ego and then learn how to discipline your ego.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was listening to something. I don't remember recently. I think maybe it might have been another YouTube video where you had said that, and I was thinking a lot about that because I feel like sometimes you want to be like, just shut up and go away, or like there's this whole like thing, popular thing now about like ego death, and I'm like, it's such a strange, like it's such a strange term to me anyway. But I'm like, I don't know if it should like die, but like it sounds like there just needs to be a better relationship. I don't know.
Well, what there needs to be is true transcendence where it's like you become bigger than the ego.
Yeah.
You become the beach rather than the little grain of sand.
Yeah, it's true.
The
And like
ego is like one grain of sand on the beach.
yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that.
You become the beach
Yeah.
and the ocean.
Okay, so my next big question is that I'm pretty sure people are like, when are you going to ask him about love? So, love, soulmates, and soul connection. So, with the pressure of evolving and working to become a more evolved soul, especially during the craziness of this year, many folks are breaking up, getting together, and somewhere in between. So, two questions around that. How do people know for sure that they are with the best person that's for them? And if they aren't, how do they go about finding that special someone?
Okay, well, again, these are
The
longer
hour.
questions. In the book Soul Integration, I have a section on soulmates, twin flames, soul family. There's only one twin flame, and they're usually in the higher dimensions. A lot of people think they've met their twin flame, but very few actually have. And it's designed that way. Your twin flame is designed to pull you up from these lower dimensions up into the dimensions where they are. But then you do have multiple soulmates, and you have what are called soul family, which are aspects that descended from the oversoul and monad, which is explained in the Soul Integration book. This is a time period where people more and more are meeting soul family members, which are very deep soulmate connections. Doesn't mean that the relationships always work out. On the human plane, sometimes, oh my God, I just met a really deep soulmate, but he's married or she's married. or something like that, but sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't on the human plane, in other words. But this is definitely a time period where people are starting to move out of karmic relationships, where you come together with someone in order to learn certain lessons. The higher form of relationship is called co-creative partnership. This is
Love
where you
that.
are equals with the other person, and your primary goal in coming together is to help each other grow and evolve and have fun doing it, hopefully. And then the final stage is the enlightened relationship, where you take full responsibility for all of your issues. You don't blame the other person or project onto the other person. You simply you're dedicated to the other person's enlightenment and to your own enlightenment. So you learn how to balance your, well, I always like to use the interlocking circles.
Mm-hmm.
And in a codependent relationship, it's all us and we, and there's no you and me.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lack of intimacy relationship, it's all you and me, and there's no overlap. In an enlightened relationship, you find the right amount of you, me, and us. Maybe your partner wants a little bit more us time, and you want a little bit more you and me time. So you kind of find a way to not really compromise. I don't really like that word, but to be flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So that maybe he wants to spend 4 days a week with you, and you want to spend 2 days a week with him. So you decide to try 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Things like that. But it's all done from a mature place. It's not done from trying to manipulate and control the other person into giving me more of what I want. That's not an enlightened relationship.
I love that. Because I had spoken to Erica a little bit earlier, and I was like, "Is there anything you think I have to ask Sal?" So she specifically wanted to know about relationships, especially now, like as people are kind of really
It's
focused.
harder for people now because I mean you don't go out into a public place and just meet somebody and as easily as you did before, and maybe online you still get to know people online, but it's just not the same, right?
Yeah. Okay. So my third and final big question: what are your thoughts on 2021? Are you hearing better, worse, the same? What are you feeling?
It all depends on what's most important to you. I think from an economic standpoint, it's actually going to be a lot worse. It's inevitable that there's going to be a lot of economic fallout from everything that's been happening. And no matter who's in the White House, there's going to be economic problems. So that's going to be one issue. It's redefining, a lot of people are going to be redefining their roles in life. Plus, a lot of institutions are going to be declining in popularity over the next 5 to 10 years, especially things like fossil fuel production and things like that, for example. And people will get stuck in their ways and they say, "Oh my God, I've been worked in the oil fields my whole life, and how am I going to convert to making electric cars?" And
Mhm.
that's an obvious example. So there's going to be a lot of reckoning. I think the stock market is out of touch with reality. So there's probably going to be a 30 to 50% correction in the stock market. Also, there's going to be a lot of side effects from the vaccines. I do think there's going to be some conflict between the United States and China. There's going to be continued conflicts between Israel and Iran. I think Russia's economy is going to improve a little bit. The weather is going to continue to be extreme, more droughts, more floods, and probably some sporadic food shortages, but not like dramatically bad, widespread food shortages like some are warning that there will be really bad food shortages. No, probably not really bad, just a few, especially people who eat beef and pork and things like that, or they may have some problems. The pigs, about half the pigs in China got a disease and couldn't be made into pork. And so the pork prices went up like 3 or 4 times in China. So there may be similar things happen here with beef. Since I haven't eaten any one of those in 30 or 40 years, it doesn't affect me. But nevertheless, it's going to force people to change their eating habits.
Give me something positive. I want to hear the good news of 2021. We need some
The
inspiration.
good news is that more people are going to continue to wake up. I think there's going to be a greater acceptance of some of the things that we've been talking about. I'm looking forward to that. I think that's going to be a beautiful thing. That's probably the big news. Yeah.
Okay, I love that. I like that makes me happy just because I feel like sometimes predictions come through and they feel so heavy. And 2020 was a really fascinating year in that, I think that the good part about it was that people got in touch with parts of themselves that they probably never would have, so it really did open people up to, a deeper connection with themselves, which I think is like the start of being able to evolve. But of course there were, like a lot of people passed away, like a lot of people lost their jobs. Like I lost my full-time job. But looking back, I'm like, okay, like it was an opportunity for me to truly shift and focus a little bit more deeply on more magical things, which makes me a lot happier than I was before. But I do think that it was such a mixed bag, so I just am hopeful that next year will be, for those that are wanting to evolve, it'll give them that ability to be able to do so. And
Yes.
maybe there's some wonderful things coming for them. That was super, super, super awesome. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of cool, very quick questions for you. They're just three of them, and they're really just about how you care for yourself. I think that as a healer, like you're doing this beautiful, magical, wonderful work. And I think that it's important to share that there are ways that, like you do ensure that you are keeping yourself like calm and grounded. So one of the first questions is, are there any consistent activities or rituals you do to maintain a sense of inner peace?
Well, sometimes doing meditations and guided meditations and things like that. Also these green smoothies. I start every day with a green smoothie. Getting out into nature when I can. Those are a few of the things. And I do a lot of just on the spot inner work, saying affirmations to myself and things like that. I've been doing that forever. And I ground myself. I do my best not to take on the energy of the people I work with. And I think I do a reasonably good job of that. And the biggest one is breathing, having been through rebirthing. And for many years, I was a rebirther. And so I just start breathing deeply whenever there's a stressful situation.
Thank you so much, Sal. Again, this was such a magical chat. Can you please tell our listeners how they can follow you on your adventures?
Yes. Well, my website, www.salrachele.com, SALRACHELE.com.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Magic Hour. Be sure to check out the show notes over at mylittlemagicshop.com for more information on today's guest, Sal Rachele. We hope to see you again next Sunday. As always, sending you so much light, love, and magic. And remember, without a dream, you can't have a dream come true. So make sure you're out there making your own magic.